Japanese children were told the Americans would kill them on sight. But when the soldiers landed, they crouched down and handed out chewing gum. The enemy was feeding them. Nobody saw that coming.
30 August 1945. Atsugi Airfield, just beyond Tokyo. The late summer heat lies heavy over crushed grass and hard-stand concrete, and the smell is a mixture of aviation fuel, wet earth, and metal warmed by the sun. A Douglas C-54 sits with its engines cooling, while American officers step down into a country that has been taught to fear their very footsteps. The air is strangely quiet. No artillery, no sirens, only the distant hum of vehicles, and somewhere beyond the perimeter, a Japan that has stopped moving for a moment to listen. In a color photograph from the Army Signal Corps collection, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur stands with his senior officers upon arrival at Atsugi, 30 August 1945. The image is crisp and orderly. The history behind it is no. What mattered in that moment was not simply that an enemy commander had landed on Japanese soil. What mattered was the promise inside the landing, that this would not be an occupation of scorched revenge alone, but an occupation that would attempt something the modern world rarely tried after total war, remaking a defeated nation without destroying it. In the language drafted for the surrender ceremony and echoed through early occupation policy, MacArthur framed the task as liberation from a system that had led Japan into slavery. And he spoke of neutralizing war potentials while remolding institutions toward democracy. Those words were both ideal and instrument, moral aspiration braided tightly to strategy. Yet grand declarations did not feed children, and they did not answer the private terrors that had been planted for years in Japanese minds. By the time American boots touched down at Atsugi, Japan's cities were burned, transportation was crippled, and the national diet had already collapsed into arithmetic. Domestic food production had fallen sharply in the final years of the war. Fishing had been choked by fuel shortages. Fertilizer and tools had been diverted to the military. And by the summer of 1945, average daily caloric intake had dropped to roughly 1,680 calories per person. Hunger that was no longer a hardship but a national condition. Millions displaced by bombing wandered through ash fields that used to be neighborhoods, and 8 million repatriates would soon return from the empire's former territories, adding new mouths to a country that could barely measure what it could still provide. In that landscape, Japanese children lived inside contradictions adults could not resolve. Some had been evacuated from the cities to the countryside as the war worsened, over 1 million in total. Yet the countryside could not fully shelter them from the thinning rations. Childhood became the sound of watery gruel hitting the bottom of a bowl, the quiet scrape of a spoon against wood, the nightly search for field grasses, the learned discipline of swallowing less than the body asked for. The government ration system persisted after surrender, but distribution failed. Deliveries were irregular, and in the worst stretches the official numbers became a cruel fiction. At one point in 1946, the rations limited the average adult to around 1,042 calories a day, far below minimum needs. And in places such as Tokyo, the average person acquired only about 70% of even that allocation, roughly 775 calories a day for months at a time. Hunger was not a headline. It was the baseline of waking life. If hunger had shaped choices in places like Saipan and Okinawa, where civilians were told death was preferable to capture. Even in the final months of the Pacific War, official messaging insisted that defeat would bring mass violation and slaughter. The expectation was not just that the Americans would win, it was that they would punish. This fear was not abstract. It became a practice. People fled before American advances, hid in caves, pressed quilts over their heads, begged silently for mercy before anyone had raised a hand. A 1946 U.S. Naval Institute report on Okinawa, written from the perspective of American military government, described how Japanese propaganda insisted American troops are beasts who would rape the women and kill all inhabitants, and how civilians initially fled almost without exception, expecting torture or death. The report also noted how quickly this terror could soften when reality contradicted indoctrination. The first cigarettes, the first candy, the unexpected medical care. It is a strange thing to watch an ideology collapse. It does not always shatter with a loud crack. Sometimes it dissolves in the palm of a hand. American soldiers carried their own expectations across the water. Many had fought a war in which Japanese resistance often meant no surrender, in which caves and buildings could hide last-ditch defenders, in which civilians might be caught in the machinery of battle or compelled into it. In the Pacific, the enemy had been portrayed as fanatical, and the experience of combat often reinforced the portrait. When occupation began, the fear of sabotage and the fear of ambush were operational concerns, not mere prejudice. The Americans arrived trained to look for danger. The Japanese waited trained to expect cruelty. Between these two kinds of training stood the fragile first contact, an encounter that could tilt toward bloodshed or toward something rarer after a war. Restraint. And then, in the weeks after surrender, as the occupation spread beyond airfields and headquarters into streets, docks, and schoolyards, a small object began to appear again and again, so small it could be hidden in a fist, so ordinary to an American that it barely deserved thought, yet so astonishing in a hungry country that it could rewrite memory. A stick of chewing gum, not a weapon, not a proclamation, not a flag, a piece of sweetness wrapped in wax paper, stamped and folded with industrial neatness, carried by the millions in pockets and ration cartons. It would become a symbol not because it was grand, but because it was casual, abundance so routine it could be given away. In Japan, children would later describe the occupation era with a phrase that sounded almost like a joke and almost like a wound. Chewing gum and chocolate. The wrapper's soft crackle became, for some, the sound of a new world arriving. Near Sasebo in 1945, a Marine crouched to speak with Japanese children, 3 of them, each carrying infants on their backs. The official caption is plain, almost bureaucratic: making friends with Japanese children near Sasebo, Marine Corps Foe 0255. The photograph does not show speeches or tribunals. It shows the posture of a soldier lowering himself so his height will not be a threat. Sasebo was a naval place, a place that knew uniforms and orders. It was also a place where defeat felt close enough to touch. Ships idle, facilities watched, authority rearranged. In such a place, Japanese boys in uniform gathered around Marines, their faces set between curiosity and caution. Another photograph from the same collection shows a Marine standing with his rifle beside a group of Japanese schoolboys, weapon present, but not raised. Power visible, but restrained. The rifle is a reminder that occupation is not friendship by choice. Yet the boys' closeness to the Marine hints at something the propaganda had not prepared them for. The enemy who does not immediately strike. The enemy who does not need to prove dominance through cruelty. For Japanese soldiers returning from the lost war, or slipping back into civilian clothes, or standing in lines for demobilization, the expectation was often humiliation and hunger, perhaps imprisonment, perhaps the moral judgment of the victors. Many had been taught that Americans were decadent and brutal, and that surrender meant disgrace. They also knew, whether admitted or not, what Japan's armies had done across Asia. The forced labor, the massacres, the organized sexual slavery that had been woven into the war machine. If a defeated man measures the victors by the yardstick of his own nation's conduct, fear becomes almost logical. And so, in those first days, kindness could look like a trick. A sweet given to a child could look like bait. But the occupation's earliest impressions were formed not only by policy, but by countless small decisions made on roadsides and near gates. The U.S. Naval Institute report on Okinawa described cheery greetings and largesse of GI rations, candy, or even cigarettes, offered to civilians along the roadside, and it noted how such gestures helped convert fear into reciprocal friendliness. It is important to understand the psychology of this. A starving society does not interpret food as mere sustenance. Food becomes proof of power, proof of intention, proof of whether the new authority will be a boot or a hand. When a soldier can afford to share what he carries, he is demonstrating not only resources but confidence. In a world of ration cards and black markets, the casual gift is almost an ideological act. A stick of gum is nearly weightless, but it has a sequence. First the wrapper, the soft paper folded tight. Then the smell, sweet, faintly artificial, a scent that suggests factories still running somewhere far away, a supply chain intact enough to make something unnecessary. Then the chew itself, stubborn and elastic. In a hungry Japan, elasticity mattered. So much of life had become brittle roofs, brittle bones, brittle certainties. Gum resisted breaking. It offered a child the sensation of having something in the mouth for longer than a swallow. The sweetness lasted beyond the first moment. It stayed. That persistence, small, stubborn, made gum a perfect symbol for a democracy that would claim it could endure, could flex, could be shaped without snapping. Not every child would have understood politics, but the body understands duration. The deeper story behind those roadside gifts was the collapse of Japan's wartime system and the urgent necessity of preventing famine on a scale that could destabilize the entire region. The rationing system had been established in 1940 and tightened until by 1945, the official diet shrank toward bare survival. In the cities, where families depended almost entirely on government rations, shortages became immediate. The black market flourished because people had to eat, and the state punished the symptoms of hunger as if hunger were a crime. The occupation authorities, seeking to keep order and rebuild, had to confront the simplest question: what happens to democratization if the electorate is starving? In the rhetoric of early occupation, democracy was often described as if it were an institutional transplant. New constitution, new rights, new elections. Yet the human body has its own constitution. When caloric intake collapses, ideology becomes secondary to bread. A parent who cannot feed a child does not argue politics. He bargains, steals, trades, breaks. Even the most disciplined society frays when the stomach rules. That is why food policy became inseparable from political policy in occupied Japan, and why American attention turned so quickly from victory ceremonies to grain shipments and nutrition programs. Hunger was not merely suffering. It was leverage for extremists, fuel for unrest, and an opening for new propaganda. This is where the contrast sharpened into something cinematic. What Japan had been told to expect from American soldiers, and what American power actually looked like on the ground. Propaganda promised monsters. Many children found instead men who, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes carelessly, sometimes sincerely, handed out sweets. This did not erase the harsh realities of occupation, nor did it erase crimes committed by individuals. But as a first impression, it mattered. A society judges the future by the first hours of contact. A child remembers a face longer than a policy memo, and a stick of gum, given without ceremony, could carry more persuasive force than 1,000 leaflets. One Japanese physician on Okinawa, Dr. Kasaburo Iyasaka, wrote a statement during the battle that captured the shock of propaganda collapsing into lived experience. He described how false stories planted the horrible thought of murderous death upon the brain of all Okinawans. And then he recorded the reversal. But the fact was reverse. I could see how the American soldiers are kind and upright to the poor and helpless peaceful man, giving them tobacco and cakes every time they meet. He called the Red Cross Hospital a mysterious wonder. The English is imperfect, the emotion unmistakable. It is evidence not only of events, but of transformation. The moment when an educated man recognizes that a worldview built on myth cannot survive contact with reality. That is the heart of the story suggested by the title. Japanese children did not expect this. They did not expect the enemy to feed them. They did not expect soldiers to carry sweetness. They did not expect an occupying army to crouch down, to lower its posture, to speak softly, to offer instead of seize. Yet the true history must be held with both hands, not one. The occupation included censorship and control. It included crime, including sexual violence in some places and periods, and a wave of fear that led Japanese authorities themselves to issue warnings to women, and even to establish systems intended to manage contact between civilians and occupying troops. The public imagination was crowded with dread, but alongside the dread, there were also moments of restraint and aid that in the streets of occupied Japan captured by archival footage, one sees children gathering around American soldiers as if pulled by gravity. In a critical past clip titled, U.S. Soldier Distributes Candies to Japanese Children in Koga, Japan. The scene is brief and silent except for imagined ambient sound, boots, murmurs, the soft stamp of many feet on dust. The children's closeness is startling if one remembers the propaganda of beasts. They do not behave like prey. They behave like children confronted with the sudden appearance of something rare, food given without exchange. Film cannot show taste, but it can show urgency. The way small hands move faster than caution, the way hunger overrides instruction. In the streets of occupied Japan captured by archival footage, one sees children gathering around American soldiers as if pulled by gravity. In a critical past clip titled, U.S. Soldier Distributes Candies to Japanese Children in Koga, Japan. The scene is brief and silent except for imagined ambient sound, boots, murmurs, the soft stamp of many feet on dust. The children's closeness is startling if one remembers the propaganda of beasts. They do not behave like prey. They behave like children confronted with the sudden appearance of something rare, food given without exchange. Film cannot show taste, but it can show urgency. The way small hands move faster than caution, the way hunger overrides instruction. This is why the symbol must remain small. If the story were told only through grand relief programs, it would become a tale of governments. But the lived occupation was a tale of pockets, the wrapper, the stick, the chew. A child does not read ration tables. A child reads faces and hands. Yet behind every offered stick of gum stood the larger machinery of American policy and global supply. Hunger in occupied Japan became a matter not only for Japanese officials, but for American strategists who feared that famine would fuel communism and destabilize East Asia. Food, in this sense, was both mercy and firewall. The official ration numbers demonstrate how close Japan came to catastrophe. When rations fall to around 1,000 calories a day and deliveries are unreliable, the body begins to consume itself. Under such conditions, people do not become politically enlightened. They become physically diminished. Black markets become inevitable. Crime becomes survival. In this environment, American administrators faced a cruel paradox. They could claim democratic ideals, but if they could not keep Japan fed, the ideals might drown. And so the occupation's morality often arrived disguised as logistics, grain shipments, wheat allocations, decisions about where food should go first. Even these decisions could be political in ways civilians would not see. MacArthur himself discussed diverting wheat shipments to address crises elsewhere in the region, recognizing that food could be the difference between stability and a psychological and political crisis. The language reveals a truth. Hunger is never only hunger in a shattered society. It is also a untouched, manufactured with care. These moments did not erase the destruction of Tokyo or the burned neighborhoods of Osaka. They did not erase grief for the dead, but they introduced a new texture into daily life: surprise. Surprise is the beginning of rethinking, an ideology built on absolute claims. The enemy is a beast, cannot survive too many small contradictions. The emotional contrast deepened because the children's bodies carried the record of defeat. The infants on backs, the thin arms, the alert eyes that had learned to measure adults quickly. In such bodies, sugar is not a triviality. It is a sudden jolt of energy, a sensation almost forgotten. It is a reminder that the mouth can taste something other than starch and bitterness. It is also, in the way children experience it, a brief restoration of childhood itself, a moment when the world stops being exclusively about endurance. The stick of gum does not feed a family, but it can remind a child that life might once again contain more than survival. For Japanese adults, especially those steeped in the wartime state, this could be humiliating. A defeated father watching his child accept candy from the former enemy might feel shame, anger, gratitude, and confusion all at once. The gift could be seen as charity, and charity can wound pride. But it could also be seen as proof that the enemy's ideology was not simply conquest for conquest's sake. If the occupying power wished only to grind Japan into dust, it could have allowed hunger to do the work. That it did not, at least not entirely, not consistently, introduced a competing narrative. That American power wanted Japan alive, functional, and eventually. There is an irony here that history cannot avoid. The same country that had burned Japanese cities with incendiaries now became the country whose soldiers were remembered for chocolate and gum. The same war that ended with annihilating force opened into an occupation that often emphasized stability, reform, and, crucially, feeding children. Humans are capable of holding contradictory memories, and nations are too. But children tend to preserve the first vivid image, the wrapper in the hand, the taste that would not end quickly, the shock of being treated as a person rather than a target. That shock had consequences. It did not instantly transform Japan into a democracy. Constitutions do not become culture overnight. But it began to soften the psychological terrain on which reforms would land. When fear decreases, people can risk participation. When the enemy is no longer a demon, cooperation becomes imaginable. Even the concept of rights becomes less abstract if the authority-wielding power sometimes shows restraint. In early post-war Japan, legitimacy was built from the top, new laws, new directives, but also from the bottom, from repeated encounters in which occupation soldiers did not behave as monsters. Food remained central because it was the daily referendum. The occupation would be judged every morning at breakfast, or at the absence of it. Over time, broader relief efforts expanded, including charity-based shipments. One post-war relief framework, Licensed Agencies for Relief in Asia, LARA, was organized by American agencies and sent supplies to Japan from 1946 to 1952. A Church World Service history of LARA describes it as a large-scale operation involving multiple agencies. Shipments of food items such as grain and powdered milk existed on a spectrum, from a soldier's pocket to shiploads of relief. The symbol was small, but it pointed toward a larger current of food entering Japan's devastated system. But the symbol must return again and again, because that is how memory works. For a child, a national relief program is invisible. A school lunch policy is invisible until it becomes a tray. Yet the occupation years would eventually include such programs. School lunches intended to provide significant calories and protein for children, and a nationwide expansion that helped stabilize nutrition. Even when the reasons behind these programs were mixed, humanitarian concern, political strategy, economic interest, the effect on children was concrete. Bread and milk, once rare, became part of a new normal. The body recovered first, the mind followed. If a stick of gum represented abundance, it also represented something else: choice. Chewing gum is not required. It is an excess. It is, in a way, freedom made edible, the freedom to spend resources on what is unnecessary. Totalitarian war economies claim every gram for the state. They do not waste sugar on children. When American soldiers handed gum to Japanese children, the gesture carried an implicit message. This is what it looks like when a society produces beyond survival. It was not a lecture on democracy. It was a demonstration of surplus. Surplus in the modern world is political. A hungry population is easy to command. A fed population becomes harder to control through fear alone. The wartime Japanese state had demanded sacrifice, had glorified hunger as discipline, had trained citizens to accept deprivation as virtue. But deprivation is a fragile foundation for legitimacy once the war is lost. The occupation, whether intentionally or not, introduced a countermyth, that a powerful nation could afford to feed even those it had defeated. This did not mean the occupation was gentle in every aspect. It did not mean justice was perfectly applied. It meant that one of the strongest tools of rule, fear, was not always used to its maximum, and that restraint began to change perceptions. In the months and years that followed, Japan's political identity would shift under occupation directives and internal adaptation. But for many children, the first shift was simpler. The enemy had a human face. The Marines were not ogres. The Americans did not immediately kill them. The first American words they heard might have been unintelligible. The meaning arrived through the hand. When the wrapper crackled open, something in the mind crackled too, the sound of a story changing. Transformation is rarely dramatic in the moment it occurs. It often looks like a child walking away chewing, trying to make the sweetness last, not knowing that the act itself is already a form of history. Yet those who study occupied Japan know that cultural transformation is built from such mundane fragments. Later photographers, writers, and historians would return to these small post-war exchanges as symbols of an era, symbols of American presence, of influence, of attraction and resentment intertwined. The gum becomes a recurring object because it captures the era's contradictions: power and generosity, humiliation and relief, foreign control, and the first tastes of a new civic order. The soldier who offers gum may not think in these terms. He may be tired, curious, or simply moved by children's faces. He may be following no policy at all. Yet his small action can align with the occupation's larger goals more effectively. It creates a memory that competes with propaganda. In the calculus of governance, that is valuable. In the calculus of human recovery, it is priceless. Still, the historian must hold the darker realities in view. The occupation's early period included disorder, crime, and deep anxieties about sexual violence. Anxieties shaped by wartime propaganda, by knowledge of Japan's own wartime conduct, and by the vulnerability of women in a defeated society. Records and interpretations differ on scale and frequency, and scholars debate how much was reported, how much was censored, and how much became myth. What is certain is that fear was real enough to shape behavior and policy, including warnings from local authorities and attempts to manage contact with occupation troops. In such a climate, a soldier giving candy to a child did not cancel fear. It pierced it briefly with contradiction. That piercing mattered because it introduced moral complexity into a time built on absolutes. Wartime ideology depends on simplicity: friend and enemy, pure and impure, divine and beast. Post-war survival depends on adaptation, and adaptation begins when the mind can no longer sustain absolutes. A child who has been told the enemy will kill her, and instead receives gum, is forced into a new kind of thinking. It is a small rupture that can widen over time into skepticism toward propaganda, toward militarism, toward the narratives that led a nation into ruin. Ni can see this widening in the words of Dr. Iyasaka as well. He framed the war as falsehood against truth, restriction against freedom, and he described how Japanese society had been pushed into superstition, into conformity, into equations where 2x2 equals 6 seems like truth. His statement is valuable not because it flatters the victors, but because it reveals the interior collapse of a myth system when confronted by defeat and by unexpected conduct from the enemy. The gum and cakes offered by American soldiers became, for him, evidence that the propaganda was false. Evidence, not rumor. The mind does not change because it is told. It changes because it experiences. In the end, the recurring sound in this story is not the roar of bombers or the crack of rifles, though those sounds are never far behind the era's silence. The recurring sound is softer. Paper unfolding, wax paper flexing, the small snap as a wrapper opens. It is the sound of American abundance made portable, the sound of a system with enough surplus to place sweetness in a soldier's ration and enough confidence to let that sweetness be given away. In a defeated nation where adults counted calories and children learned to be quiet about hunger, that sound could feel like a kind of heresy against despair. And so the epilogue returns to the smallest object, because history often hides its turning points inside trivial things. The occupation of Japan would be argued in constitutions and treaties, in policy shifts and Cold War calculations, in the tension between reform and control. But for many Japanese children, the first, undeniable proof that the world had changed was something they could taste. A stick of gum, elastic, persistent, became a private lesson that power could appear without immediate cruelty, that the enemy could sometimes act with restraint, that abundance could be real, and that the future might contain choices again. The gum did not make Japan free. It did not absolve the past. It did not erase the ash. But it introduced, in the middle of hunger, a new possibility, that freedom and plenty might be connected, not because either is perfect, but because a society that can afford to be generous is a society no longer ruled solely by fear. And when fear loosens its grip, even a defeated child can begin, slowly, to imagine a life that is more than survival, an imagination that is,